Sleep and stress are one of those things that I think are just foundational to everything. Like, number one, I look at movement, mobility, exercise. Number two is I look at nutrition. Under the hood, which is tiers 3 and 4, I like to look at sleep and stress management, which is what we're talking about in this one. How these things impact your nutrition, the decisions you make around your nutrition, the cravings you get around your nutrition, how it impacts your mobility, how it impacts your training. So it obviously has a lot of upstream effects and downstream effects that could be detrimental to your success. All right, Pursuit of Balance, episode 50. What is up, y'all? We're going to talk about nutrition this episode. Nutrition is obviously one of those topics that I like to come back to at least every couple months, just because it's such an apparent part of my conversations with clients all the time. And I think it's just something that always needs to stay top of mind for everyone else. So to jump right into it, I basically broke this episode up into top 12 nutrition strategies, and I'm going to work from 12 all the way down to number one. Obviously, break down why I kind of ranked them that way. The ranking, I will say, was one of the harder parts kind of last night to kind of put together of like, I tried to do this based off the hierarchy of thinking for you guys. And a lot of these things actually have evolved and changed for me too over time, just on a personal level and on a coaching level of like, what are the things that I need to deem as most important for somebody? And I like the hierarchy ranking for me. Like the more viral term is the S tier, the A tier, the B tier of like, well, what are the things that we should really be allocating the most effort, resources, energy, and just mind share towards when we're thinking about things. I'm always been a kind of an approach and mindset towards just low hanging fruit. Like, what is an easy thing that can have a lot of ROI? There's a lot of times that we see people that just major in the minors and we kind of get a little too lost in some of these little, single digit percentage of change for people. And I went through that a lot. And I think there's this natural dynamic that happens in life when you start to become a little bit more educated in a subject and start to learn a little bit more about a subject, that you start to get all excited about these little fancy details. And then you realize that over time, as you start to get back to it, that you're like, wow, really, it's just these core things that I really need to kind of focus on. And when I think about diets too, just in general, it doesn't matter if it's, the vegan or it's keto or it's intermittent fasting or vertical diet. I mean, there's a million diets out there, obviously. It's like, what makes the diets all work has always been kind of my principle that I like to follow, of like, not what makes keto special, but what makes keto and intermittent fasting work. What makes these two diets work, and then trying to extract the parallels from all of them, as I think has always kind of been just my focus. So to start from the top, number 12, I'm sorry, is nutrient timing. Nutrient timing for me, I will say, it's kind of changed a little bit. And I say the context of this statement would be the only time I would say this actually matters more than right now would be someone that's maybe on the more performance side of training, or if I'm training an athlete or training somebody for any athletics or sporting endeavor, because then the nutrient timing matters more. For those that don't know what nutrient timing is A, the timing of just the general calories that we're taking in. B, to get a little bit more granular, is the timing of like, do I time my protein? When's the best time to have carbs? When's the best time to have fats, etc. And I personally, I would say, was more strong on nutrient timing being more important than it is. And over time, I've realized that like the 11 in front of them, I think, are more important. So this is obviously why I have it at the top. And, there's a lot more than 12 nutrition strategies. I just try to kind of condense down to the things that I think are more important to talk about. So the one thing that I do want to remind people is, like, when you think about nutrient timing, the late night eating, which is the thing that I fall victim to the most, my wife and I, is when you eat really late, and especially when it's a heavier meal, it is just ruining your sleep architecture, right? So the quality is going to diminish. The quantity, naturally, just because the quality diminishes, is going to kind of be a little erratic. So when you think about things like the first, 2-3 hours of sleep is where we're going to get the most amount of deep stages of sleep, right? And then the back end of sleep, when we look at someone's sleep or the architecture of it, that's where we're going to get most of our REM. So if I have someone that's drinking alcohol late at night, or if I have someone that's eating a really big meal, if I look at blood sugar regulation at night versus something in the middle of the day, there is a big change in that. So that is the one thing that I will say has probably the most context for just us in general population to know, is like eating really late at night is going to affect sleep, right? And this is something I will touch on more. On the athletic part of it, I will say that, timing your carbohydrates around races, around physical activity, timing your electrolytes and you just your nourishment and replenishment in general, I think does have some context around the timing of events. So that is where I will say it probably could be even more important for that specific kind of avatar. But for most of us, when you think about nutrient timing and why I think it's the least important out of the list that I have for today, is the most important thing is just making sure that you're getting everything in versus trying to time it, right? I wouldn't waste your mind share on the timing of these things versus just am I getting them in? Yes or no, right? Number 11, diet breaks and refeeds. So I put this down as I think it's more of a psychological benefit. There's been a lot of myths that's been busted around having a cheat meal. Like for those that don't know, a diet break would be like, hey, maybe I'm a little bit more strict with my diet for the weekdays, and then I have a little bit of more lax on the weekends, right? Or maybe once a week, if I'm being really strict, I go have my cheat meal. And like I remember when I used to do show prep, my coach would always give me my cheat meal and he's like, go eat whatever you want. Like, it doesn't matter if it's calories, it could be more carbs, be more fats, like go whatever you want. I just want it to be on leg day. So for mine was always like on Fridays, I would go to In-N-Out, I would go to Krispy Kreme. So I get myself a big burger, some fries, some shakes, some donuts, and I would just load all this sugar and salt and carbs and fats back. But at the end of the day, we're looking at an allocation over the week, right? So the idea that this is going to metabolically revamp yourself, which is kind of what this diet break and cheat meals have been sold over the last, decades of time, when we kind of think about talking this to a normal person of like, oh yeah, it's good for you because it's going to help speed up your metabolism from being in such a deficit. That's not necessarily because of the diet break or the specific food that you're eating. That's just because you're eating enough calories back. So that's where I always like to remind people the allocation over the week is going to be the more important thing that we're looking at. So when I look at all calorie counting or all macronutrient kind of like adjusting or kind of tracking, I always like to remind people that I personally take a more weekly approach than I do a daily approach, because there is going to be these little cycles where some days you eat a lot more than normal, some days you eat a lot less than normal, and not getting too stressed out or lost in this idea that I need to be perfect day by day, 365 days a year. It's like, I rather just look at what is the weekly, right? So it's like, if I need to eat 200 grams of protein every day, that's like, well, 200 times 7, that's 1,400 grams over the week, right? Or it's like, if I need to hit X amount of calories a day, I multiply that number by 7, and that's just generally what I try to kind of focus on as far as goal. So if I was sitting down talking to somebody about calorie tracking or just any type of tracking, that's generally kind of the approach I take. So diet breaks and refeeds is more at the top of the list. Just because I don't think that's necessarily something you guys need to think about from a metabolic approach or from a fat burning approach. I would look at it as diet breaks, having a more flexible diet, having a more balanced diet. I think it's just going to be great from the psychological break that's kind of needed from being more strict with your diet. And I will say that over time, the cleaner your diet gets, the more, and I don't want to use the word strict because that can almost fall in the category of restriction for some people, but to an idea, when that quality kind of cleans up over time, that need for those diet breaks, that need for the sugar, that need for the carbohydrates or processed food kind of diminishes over time because your palate changes, right? And you get used to just good stuff, right? And there's not really a need for that. And that was always one of those things, like with the flexible dieting. For those that don't know what flexible dieting is, was always like, or if it used to be called if it fits your macros, that like, oh, you can eat whatever you want. It's just make sure it sticks within this macro, make sure it sticks within this calorie. And that is true, but it is obviously much harder to sustain depending on the quality of the food, which once again, I will talk about later. So the diet breaks and refeeds, I think, is certain populations, certain groups. And I always like to remind people, I call this the top 12 nutrition strategies. All nutrition strategies are tools within a toolbox, right? And you don't need the same tool for every job. Certain jobs require different tools. And I use that as an analogy that each individual listening to this episode or reading this or whatever it might be, you might be in a different circumstance than me. So the tool that you need to fix your job might be different, right? So that is just kind of understanding that diet breaks work really well for some people. Diet breaks are less needed for some people. 10, micronutrient sufficiency. So when we think about micronutrients, I always say that this is your vitamins, this is your minerals, comes from the quality of food, this comes from, you know, A lot of times when you even think about the supplement side of things, I think a lot of times we get lost in the micronutrients sometimes of like, my wife, for example, right now being pregnant, like she's a little low on iron. So she's needing to supplement now with an iron supplement because she just doesn't eat enough red meat. And obviously that's where we get a lot of iron in our diet too, or one of the many sources that we can get iron from. So she's supplementing with that. But for a client, and I tried to keep this episode focused on weight loss, general health, longevity, kind of this the normal goal that most of us have, but trying to get really specific on what certain vitamins am I getting, what certain nutrients, what certain minerals am I getting, because there are a lot. There's zoo nutrients, there's fungi nutrients, there's phytonutrients, there's mineral. I mean, there's a lot of different things, and it's a big list of things. So trying to focus on making sure that you're allocating the right things is something that I would say is a little bit of majoring the minors once again, right? 9, meal frequency and consistency. I grew up kind of in the more bodybuilding approach of things. I grew up, in the 90s and the early 2000s where like the thing was like you just have a bunch of small meals every day, right? So instead of eating 3 meals a day, let's shoot for 6 meals a day, right? And that consistency, there's kind of 2 parts to this, right? So there's the frequency and the consistency, and obviously there's parallels, but there is some separation here too. The meal frequency matters less. That myth has kind of been busted because once again, it's almost like the nutrient timing example I gave you, that we're looking at a certain allocation for the day or the week, depending on how you're looking at it. And saying that you're getting X amount of calories or X amount of protein or X amount of whatever through 6 meals or 3 meals or 2 meals matters less. Where I think the context lies in this one is the sustainability for your lifestyle and your schedule and your hunger levels. Because I know that there are some people that, I'll start with me. I'm someone that normally is not very hungry in the morning. Like it's rare for me to wake up and be like, okay, I'm hungry. Like I just kind of get my day going. I'll start with some water, start with some coffee, and I can rock and roll for about 4 or 5, 6 hours. And, sometimes I'll do smoothies. I would say about 4 days a week. I do something like I need a liquid kind of meal for me personally, just because I'm not hungry. And then I'll have a medium-sized meal or moderate meal at lunch, and then I'll have a bigger meal late at night. And like that's just what works for me and just like my kind of cycle of hunger, right? Also the schedule part of it, right? If I were to tell someone to have 6 meals a day, when I was doing men's physique competitions, I was doing 4 or 5 solid meals and then 1 or 2 shakes a day. So I was doing anywhere from like at an absolute minimum 4 or 5, but probably closer to that, like sometimes 7. It's a lot. Like it's a full-time job trying to think about like, oh, every 2 or 3 hours I need to eat. The old school knowledge on it was like, we can only have up to 30 grams of protein. Like that's the amount that our body can partition for amino acids, blah, blah, blah. And there's now, obviously, there was a study that came out a few years ago that was saying like, oh, we can have upwards of 100 grams of protein in a meal and still be able to take it in. There's a little bit of the timing aspect of that too, that we're actually more effective at taking some of that in post-workout or around workout times. But for the general population, for the normal people that are listening to this, like myself, I wouldn't get lost in the sauce of making meal frequency the biggest deal. The consistency part of it, the part that I would argue that's parallel to the frequency is like the consistency is just your total intake, I would say, is the thing that's the most important to kind of pay attention to. So I do think there's some validity to that. But like if you have one day where you have 4 small meals and you have one day where you have 2 big meals, you have one day where you have only 1 huge meal, and you have one day where you kind of snack throughout the day. If I'm looking at the total amount once again, I'm not as concerned with it. The consistency does lie for those that appreciate structure, that I think the routine helps, right? Because I'll give you an example on workout timing. I get the question a lot with new clients that have like, what's the best time to work out, right? And I'm always like, what's the time that allows you to have the best adherence, right? Like, do you feel like you're more energetic in the morning, or do you feel your schedule with the kids and work is going to be better at this time? Like, let's just pick for your schedule what's going to be the best. And then most importantly, let's book out those days and those times for weeks and months in advance. Why? Because I'm someone that owns a gym. I work in a gym for a living, so I spend a lot of time here. I still have to put in my schedule. Like for me, it's Monday through Thursday, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. My schedule says workout, eat, coffee. Like that's what it says the exact same. So I'll block out 2 hours Monday through Thursday at the same time. What I've noticed, and I've done this now for about 7 years, 6 years straight, that it's just like, it helps me think that like my workout time is always 1 o'clock. So like my meals have kind of accommodated to the workout time, my schedule, my energy, my mood. Like I kind of look forward to my workouts in the middle of the day. It's a break from my work. So I have that habit built, which is really important. And a lot of times stacking the habit is a hard part for a lot of people in all areas of life, but obviously, especially nutrition. So I will say that would be an argument that I would push back for some people, that maybe having something that is more consistent based off your lifestyle, schedule, eating habits, hunger levels, all the stuff that I was just talking about could be more important, right? So, but don't think about, there is no right answer. If you feel good with 4 meals a day, go for it. If you feel good with 2 meals a day, go for it. What I'm going to look at the end of the day is the total allocation, right? That would be the big one. Okay, number 8, carb and fat balance, right? This one I've gone through a couple cycles of changing my mind a handful of times, and I just think from kind of the analysis paralysis of like learning more about how carbs interact with the body, how fat interacts, and then you start to see some of the waves of the things that change as far as what becomes, in a sense, more mainstream. When I look at macronutrients, the three that obviously come to the mind, right, are protein, carbs, and fats, right? These are technically the three. I have like another kind of hidden balance of them that I talk about: fiber, I talk about alcohol, and I talk about water. So generally in my conversations with nutrition with some, I like to kind of bring up 6 macros as kind of the things that I focus on. Um, but if I were to look at overall calories and I would extract protein from this conversation, the balance between the carbs and fats, for majority of us, I do like to kind of put it in a little bit more of a category of preference, right? And I'll give you as much context as I can here. For me, like, I'll give you an example. When I did my PNOE test, my resting metabolic test, my VO2 max test, it said that my carbs and fats, based off my metabolic flexibility, based off everything and the metrics and scores that I had, that I should be pretty balanced, right? The normal person, I would say 15 to maybe 35% of your calories are going to come from fat, right? Carbs, I think, is probably the lever that has the most dynamic flexibility just because of someone's preference or whatever it might be. Um, so when I look at fats, here's what I will say has kind of changed for me. And I'll break them both down. When I was younger, I grew up in the low fat, non fat kind of culture, right? Like, it was very normal to like limit bacon, limit the fatty cuts of meats. We don't have butter, we have margarine instead. We do vegetable oils, like everyone, maybe for those that are old enough, remember like the country crock and I can't believe it's not butter and all the processed bullshit that like now I wouldn't eat. But we removed fats. Like, it was very low fat. And then when I started getting into more of the men's physique type of training and bodybuilding type of a training and that approach and dieting also, it was very normal to say like high protein, high carbs, or like high to medium carbs. Carbs would be a little cyclical, but fats were always pretty minimal, right? We just had enough fats to kind of keep us healthy. And then there's this kind of next wave that happens where it was like keto started becoming mainstream and fat started becoming popular, and then carnivore started becoming popular. And then I started kind of adopting a lot more fats. And I was like, okay, now I'm eating the grass-fed butter and still having a lot of Kerrygold. And I will say I still have a decent amount. Adding more olive oil, not being scared of ribeyes, not being scared of bacon, and just like adding that stuff back to the diet. The one thing that we need to remember about fats more than any other macronutrients is it's 9 calories per gram. So it's the most calorically dense macronutrient that we have. So for those who are thinking about weight loss or managing weight overall, that's obviously a macronutrient that you need to be aware of. From a health perspective, you got to remember that the cell membranes, the hormonal function in the body requires fats, right? And then there's also certain things that are more fat soluble as far as vitamins and things like that in the body. So generally the rule of thumb is like if I can get 0.3 of my overall body weight, right? So if I'm 100 pounds, I want to have 30 grams of fat. If I'm 200 pounds, I want to have 60 grams of fat. That is kind of like the minimum effective dose, but generally also I would say a better word is maybe the target that most people kind of should shoot for as far as fat intake. Now the carbs, now here's what I would say, just kind of last thing for fat. The fats and carbs together is where most of us get in trouble, right? So think about all the best foods, right? Think about your ice cream. Think about your pizza. Think about your Alfredo pasta, all the things I used to love as a kid and still love as an adult. There is a little neurochemistry thing that's happening upstairs that can kind of trick the body into eating a little bit more. So it really, in a sense, blunts the satiety signal in a sense where we can overeat on those calories and that consumption becomes a problem. And that's where I think high fat, high carb together is where I would say is a dangerous mix for some people. And that's where we even look at some of the insulin resistance that's developed, some of the blood sugar regulation, some of the over calorie consumption that happens. I think it's when these two macros are in a high level together is where most of us get in trouble. If you have something low fat or a high carb by itself, it's not a problem. If you have something high fat, low carb, I think it's less of a problem. So The carb side of it is, and I would say this for both carbs and fats, the quality, right? Like I want to be looking at the quality of the carbohydrates, right? So do I think carbs are bad? The answer is no. Was there a period of time where I thought carbs were bad? Yeah. I was like, oh yeah, restrict carbs for some of these people, right? Like you need little to no carbs. When the reality of it, that is like that's a false statement, right? I think carbs have context once again, which I'll touch on. That if I were to look at something like vegetables, right? I would never say vegetables are bad for people, right? There's certain vegetables that come with more anti-nutrients that, yeah, you can say, okay, this got a little bit more oxalates. These foods have more lectins. Like there's context to certain vegetables in certain groups, the nightshades, things like that, where maybe for certain individuals we need to be aware of. Fruit has been another thing that's been demonized for a long period of time, and I don't think that that's something that I would ever try to pull back from somebody. I think if you can eat it a little bit more seasonal, I think if you can eat a little bit more geographical, meaning depending on where you live, should dictate kind of the amount of fruit consumption somebody has. Potatoes, white rice. There's plenty of communities and cultures in this world that have plenty of white rice and that are much healthier than Americans, but some reason we think white rice is terrible for us. So the processed, the ultra processed, those type of carbohydrates, because they're generally mixed with more fats, that's where I think a lot of us get in trouble. But to wrap up that, the balance of those two things, I will say, is going to be dictated more on a preference level. If you're someone that likes a little bit more high carb and low fat, go for it. If you're someone that prefers a little bit more high fat and low carb, go for it. If you're someone that's not as metabolically flexible, that's where would say the last little piece that I'll give you guys is that's where some of the context lies that I would say, like, yeah, maybe reducing carbs for either a period of time or cyclically periods of time, right? Having some type of carb restriction or lower carb phases can be maybe effective for somebody because the idea of metabolic flexibility is, can I use both substrates? Can I use glucose, aka carbs? Can I use fatty acids as fuel? If your body's always reliant on carbs, your body is not that metabolically flexible. We want to get the body, especially at rest or lower levels of exercise, to be efficient at burning fat. And that could be based off your aerobic capacity, or that could be based off your metabolic flexibility at rest. Excuse me. So that's where I would say some of that context lies. But at the end of the day, the balance is going to be calories, protein, whatever, or calories minus protein, whatever's left, preference. 7, fiber, satiety, your gut health, your glucose response. Ideally, we're trying to shoot for about 25 to 35 grams a day. Some males maybe getting closer to 40. Size of this obviously would dictate the quantity of the fiber. But, the things that I read off is like fiber is going to help with satiety. Fiber is going to help with the gut microbiome. Fiber is going to help blunt the glucose response, right? So you're not getting as aggressive of a blood sugar spike when you're eating things that have more fiber in them. And if you think about what happens when I'm eating fiber, right? I'm eating more whole foods, I'm eating more whole grains, I'm eating more vegetables, I'm eating more fruits, I'm eating things that contain fiber, naturally are going to just kind of lead you as a byproduct to the better quality of food choice, right? So fiber is one of those things. It's kind of, I don't want to say mainstream, but I think like a lot of people have been talking about protein a lot. And it's like, for me, it's funny because like I've always talked about protein. And I think anybody that works in this industry, like protein's always been talked about. For general population, the people don't professionally do this. Like maybe it feels like protein's now becoming more mainstream. But I will tell you from my experience doing this for 18 years, it's not mainstream to the people that work in the industry. It's mainstream maybe to general population. Fiber's kind of hit like another run. I feel like it's got a little momentum where people are starting to talk about it again. But like at the end of the day, think about it this way. It's like if you're prioritizing fiber and you're prioritizing protein and like that is your diet focus, what are those two foods going to lead you to? Naturally, they're going to be a little bit more whole foods, right? You're going to get more animal protein just in order to hit that quota. You're going to eat more fibrous things like vegetables and fruits and whole grains like we talked about. So they naturally just lead you down a better path of like the food quality being a thing. But there are things like resistant starch of like, certain cultures where they actually like, if you were to look at like sushi rice, it's like they cook the rice and they let it cool, right? When you cool cooked rice or you cool cooked potatoes, it actually builds up the resistant starch, which is great for gut microbiome. It's great for the blood sugar response. Then there's things like insoluble fiber. Then there's things like soluble fiber. So different foods bring different things. But at the end of the day, we do want to have a fiber as a big part of the diet. Having very low fiber has been shown on all aspects of health to be a negative thing, right? So prioritizing more fiber is going to be a huge piece to that. And it's not just the typical digestive thing. Like when I was my last show, I always bring this up as an example. My coach had me supplementing Metamucil, right? And that's just because I didn't really have a lot of fiber in my diet. It was like I was eating lean proteins. So lean red meat or chicken, tilapia, like shrimp, like those are always my go-to. I had white rice 80% of the time, 20% was potatoes. And then I'd have just like a couple ounces, maybe 1 or 2 ounces of some asparagus or some broccoli, have a little bit of fiber. I would have a little handful of some almonds or cashews every once in a while. But you could tell just like that approach was built on like just giving enough fiber to maybe feel like you're still digestively working, giving you enough fat so you can kind of hormonally kind of stay regulated. And I will say that's not the best diet approach from a health perspective, but don't get me wrong, that diet approach worked really, really well when it comes to body composition or recomping or weight loss or whatever it might be. So it's like it's clear that high protein, moderate to high carbs based off your training and then sprinkling in your fiber and fat was obviously something that was effective. But as always, there's nuance. Okay, so number 6 is alcohol awareness. As someone that drinks red wine every night, this is something that, like, there's part of me that has a bias that's like, oh, yeah, you should be able to have your flexibility. You should be able to have your alcohol. But I will say, myself included, and everyone that I'm talking to here listening to this, that it is empty calories. It's going to change your food choices and the quality of the food that you're eating. It's going to ruin sleep quality. It's going to blunt fat oxidation because, removing the ethanol is basically the byproduct of what we're going to get from alcohol. It's going to become your body's number one priority of removal. And then it just is going to hinder your recovery, right? And there's going to be something that you guys will hear next week on an episode where I'm going to talk a little bit more about fascia and some injury stuff, but like also just the hydration of tissue, right? So it's just like it is a diuretic. It's extracting and pulling water out of the body. So alcohol is just one of those things that it doesn't really, from a nutrition standpoint, from a sleep standpoint, from a recovery standpoint, it is something that can get so many people in trouble. Now, the context, because I am a red wine drinker and I want to back myself a little bit too. Kayvon's probably going to laugh at this post because he feels like I'm always backing up alcohol. There's context to it. I think there's an element of social benefit for people. There's an element that having some balance, if you do want to have it, is totally fine. There's ways to look at alcohol consumption to restrict calories for those that still want to have it. Having clear liquor, like if I'm having like a vodka tonic or a gin and tonic, is going to be a lot lower calories than going and having a Mai Tai, right? Or things like beer or things like white wine, things that have more sugar, things that have more calories. So there's ways to moderate it still. The timing of the alcohol, if you're having alcohol right before bed, obviously is going to impact sleep a lot more than having alcohol like during the day and then stopping early. So you give your body time to remove it. So like there's ways to work around it. There's ways to manage the calories. And there's also ways to manage, well, for some of us, manage the volume where it doesn't impact some of the food choices too, because I'm sure everybody knows, you could be yourself included, that like when you get a little buzz, you have a little drink, you have a night out, it's like, oh, you got the munchies, you want some shitty food, or you have a hangover the next day. What are you craving? You're craving more salt, you're craving more fat, you're craving more sugar and carbs. So it just has these downstream effects that feels like you got to start to spin your wheels where you're not making as much progress. So it is a really, really important thing. It's not top 5, but it's 6. I mean, like it's a big thing that I think if you are having a decent amount of volume in alcohol, or alcohol at all, and you're trying to be a little bit more strict, like you need to be aware of that, right? Like, but just understand, like as all these things I've talked about, there are ways to work around it where you can take healthier roads or healthier approaches to it. All right, now we're in the top 5. And this definitely actually has nothing to do with nutrition directly, but it indirectly does. And it's sleep and stress, right? Because the spike that you get in your hunger hormones, right? Ghrelin goes up, the satiety signals, right? So when you think about leptin, obviously go down. And then you think about your decision making, or a better way to say it, your willpower to make decisions is hindered and is blunt, right? So sleep and stress are one of those things that I think are just foundational to everything. Like for me, I my 6 dimensions is number 1, I look at movement, mobility, exercise. Number 2 is I look at nutrition. Like this is my top tier. This is where I spend 70 to 80% of my time talking about and coaching. Under the hood, which is tiers 3 and 4, I like to look at sleep and stress management, which is what we're talking about in this one. How these things impact your nutrition, the decisions you make around your nutrition, the cravings you get around your nutrition, the caloric intake that you're craving, your ability to do so, right? How it impacts your recovery, how it impacts your mobility, how it impacts your training. So it obviously has a lot of upstream effects and downstream effects that could be detrimental to your success. So if you're somebody that is chronically stressed and you are in the sympathetic state, you are fight or flight, your body is not working to rest and digest. So even the calories that you are eating, you're not being that effective at the digestibility kind of side of it. Then when we look at kind of sleep, You got to remember, sleep is where we go through all this lymphatic drainage, right? This is where we go through memory consolidation. So there are obviously a lot of things on the health side out of that. But then we look at the growth hormone spike that we get, the recovery behind that. And when I hinder those things, so when I have bad quality of sleep or low quantity of sleep, my hormones are off the next day, my cravings are going to be off, and my willpower to make the right decisions are off. If I'm stressed out all the time, how many people do you know, and you might be one of them, that the number one reason and the number one thing that they try to work on is stress eating? There's so many people that I work with that the number one thing they're like, what do you need the most help with? And they put stress eating. So is it the eating that I need to fix, or is it the stress I need to fix? And it's like, well, if I can address the stress, then the byproduct of stress eating maybe dwindles and goes away. So, like that's just like something to think about. Is like the stress and sleep have such a big impact on the strategies of mitigation for proper nutrition, right? So that's number 5. Number 4, I've touched on this a handful of times already. Food quality. And what I mean by food quality is some of the things that I've changed my mind on a little bit just through kind of some of the data that's come out is like the idea that we need to have organic versus non-organic, right? And some of the nutrients was like my argument like years ago was like, why would you not try to have organic, right? Where we can remove some of the pesticides, we get the farming practices are going to be a little bit more regenerative. And I still kind of believe, and I still buy organic. So I will say this, that even though I would kind of say this as education for people, that it's less of a worry, that financially, if you can't, two ways to say this. Financially, if you can't afford to be eating organic all the time, do not be stressed out of eating non-organic fruits or vegetables, right? If you don't have access to organic foods, then don't stress out about eating non-organic fruits, vegetables, things like that. Ideally for me, it's like I like to eat wild caught fish versus farm raised. I like to try to do my best to have grass-fed, grass-finished beef and like all these things, right? Regenerative farming is going to be a thing that I just kind of personally believe in as far as the typical agriculture that we've had. When you think about pasture raised eggs versus like all that stuff that's talked about in the levels of eggs, I will always look at quality being something that I deem is more important for me, because I just believe that, like, why would I not try to put the highest quality thing into my body if I can? But what I'm talking about today with this food quality being number 4 is whole food versus processed food. The processed food argument existed in the It Fits Your Macros cult. I mean, maybe not cults is the right word, but whatever. Maybe it is a cult. The flexible dieting, like that, like environments, that cult. What they really were preaching is you can have whatever the fuck you want. You can have the candy, you can have the ice cream. And I know their messaging was not geared around let's get people to just eat more shit food. The messaging was coming from a good place. If you have the ability to be able to eat ice cream, you have the ability to go have Oreos, you have the ability to go have a dessert, you have the ability to have a burger. What's most important is, does that fit into the goal that we have for calories and macros? So I do want to back that up. I don't want to make it feel like I'm bashing that. But my argument has always been like, if you were to just focus 80% of your effort with your diet on just eating whole foods, does it come from something that's walked, flown, or swam before, right? Like that's where majority of our animal protein is going to come from, right? Does it come from something that needs sun and water to grow? Produce, fruits, vegetables, things like that. And all of those things, right? If that was 80+% of your diet, it's really, really, really hard to fuck up. Like my example with the fruit thing is like, how many people do you know that are overweight from blueberries? Like it doesn't exist. Like I say that all the time is one of my favorite jokes when people say like, is fruit bad for you? I heard it's got fructose and it's bad for your blood sugar. It's like, no, like how can fruit be bad for you, right? Like I think anything could be bad based off the context of the volume. But when you think about the quality of the food and the nutrients that we're trying to extract, what is whole food going to give you that processed food won't? Obviously, there's additives to it too, but it's like, it's the vitamins, it's the minerals, it's the thing that I put as number 10 as micronutrient sufficiency. If I were to make food quality, whole foods, my focus for the client, I can immediately remove the micronutrient sufficiency because I'm going to get it. As long as my diet's diverse, right? As long as my diet's got a pretty good balance of plants and animal proteins and things like that, I'm not worried about that with that person, right? There's context, as always, but like that's for the majority of us, like that's fine, right? So that's a big one for me. Now we're in the top 3. Number 3, is adherence and sustainability. At the end of the day, the only thing that works is the one that you can do forever. I put lifestyles in my business name because I like to preach this idea that weight loss challenges, that diets for a 6 week challenges, why I've never been a huge believer. I do them every once in a while, but why I've never been a huge believer of pushing that message is because the narrative of timeline never gets addressed. The goal is to create a lifestyle around this, right? So the goal is to find something that can work forever. And what works forever are things that have a degree of moderation, that things that have a degree of fun and enjoyment, right? Things that have a degree of built-in sustainability, right? So like the most important thing is adherence behind it. So if you are doing something that your conscious or unconscious mind clearly knows that there's no way in fucking hell that I can sustain this for the rest of my life. There's no way I'm going to weigh my food on a scale. There's no way I'm going to track my things forever. Then the exit strategy needs to be a big part of the conversation with yourself or whoever you're working with. Don't get me wrong, weighing food works, tracking food works. All these diet strategies and tools that I talk about are all effective for certain people. What's going to make it effective for you as the individual forever is how do I find a way to make this more sustainable, right? And that is building in the adherence behind it. All right, number two, touched on this a few times already, and I will touch on this for the rest of my life. Protein. If you were to just prioritize more protein in your diet, I promise everything would be easier. Now, everyone that I talk to, when I'm talking about clients, thinks that they're like, oh, I'm eating a lot of protein. And then I finally have them track it. And I'm like, you ain't even close, right? At an absolute minimum, zero point 0.7. Females, you have a little bit more leeway than a male, right? And that's just based off body composition, right? That we look at a little bit more of this as alignment to lean body mass, right? Like a female naturally will hold anywhere from 7 to 10% more body fat. And that's something we want. It's not something that's just going to be different. You should work against. But the goal is to be ideally at a minimum 7, but close to a gram per pound of goal body weight, right? So for me, I'm a 195-pound male. I'm trying to shoot for 195 grams of protein as much as I can. Am I perfect? Absolutely not. But that is my number one priority when I'm making my diet, right? So this morning I had a smoothie, just like I do a lot of weekdays. I have whey protein that has about 24 or 28 grams of protein. I have some Greek yogurt in there, which has another 18 grams of protein. I have a little bit of collagen. Doesn't have leucine. It's not a muscle building protein. It's still protein. Then I'm going to have lunch that's going to be centered around a double protein meal. I DoorDash a decent amount, and I always, every single time, order double protein, sometimes even triple. And then when I go home at night, I have a big protein meal. So if you can keep the majority of your mindset on as far as macronutrients around protein, because remember this, it's very satiating, so it's going to keep you fuller longer, which is going to prevent you from overeating. Number two, it's the highest thermogenic effect of any macronutrient, meaning that 20 to 30% of the calories you ingest are going to be burned just through the digestion process. 100 calories come in, I'm only taking in 70 to 80 calories. So I'm burning calories just by eating protein. So calories are all not created equal. 100 calories of French fries is different than 100 calories of chicken, right? As far as the total net calories. So when you think about that, it's like, okay, like I said, thermogenic effect of it. We have the satiety side of it. We have the amino acids that we need to actually build muscle. Allowing us to build more muscle allows us to speed ourselves up more metabolically because that increases your BMR, because muscle is a very metabolic kind of tissue. So there's a lot of benefits on protein, right? And like that is why we try to generally gear it that way. And then the second and most important is most people just don't eat enough. So it's like, why not just keep all your focus or majority of your focus on eating more protein? And the natural byproduct is, oh, I stopped overeating on the carbs and fats. I stopped overeating on the processed things. If you can get it from more whole food, I will always say 10 times over 10 that is what I would try to recommend. But supplement when you need. Obviously, there's going to be certain things that have supplements or added protein into it. Totally fine, but protein is a huge focus. And then the last one and the final boss of everything that we're talking about today is caloric balance. At the end of the day, if your goal is to gain weights, lose weights, maintain weight, you need to remember the law of thermodynamics, which is there is energy going out and there is energy coming in. Energy going out is your basal metabolic rate. right? So the amount of calories you burn at rest. There's a non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So me talking to you and keep my eyes open and fidgeting and stuff like that. There's 3 is your exercise activity. And 4 is the thermic effect of food, which is basically certain macronutrients have a certain percentage of food or calories that are burned just in digestion, right? Protein number 1, carbs number 2, fat number 3, right? So that is your total daily energy expenditure. How do I improve this? I can build more muscle to increase my BMR. I can move more, take more steps, walk more often to burn more calories with my non-exercise. And number 3, how do I improve exercise activity? Exercise more. Number 4, how do I improve my TEF? Have more protein, moderate your carbs, and minimize your fats. Like, don't have a lot of fats and go overboard with that, because net calories are just going to be higher and the concentration of total calories are going to be a lot higher too. Energy going out is those things. Energy coming in is the things you eat. So we've all heard this. You exercise more and you eat less, and that's how you lose weight. And that's a very oversimplified way to say weight loss, but it's true, right? Like, the people that can afford to have the most flexible diet or the most calories in the diet are also high-level athletes. So when you look at these people that are like, oh, how did Michael Phelps eat 10 pizzas a day? The guy is burning 10,000 calories plus a day, probably. I mean, when you're training 2, 3, 4, 5 hours a day for a sport, you have an expenditure that is 10x over the normal person, right? So you can afford a lot more calories. My analogy I like to give you is, why is the billionaire allowed to be on his yacht in the Mediterranean taking a month or 2 off? Well, because the guy or girl has a lot more money than you do, and I do, so we can't take that much time off. So think about it being the same way. It's like, I have 2 sides to the equation on this scale that I can do. I can either learn how to get my body to burn more calories out of the 4 things I gave you, or I can learn how to adapt my diets and my nutrition to eat less calories, or the perfect world, a little bit of both, right? Because a little bit of both, I will say it's more sustainable, right? Versus training 5 hours a day just to be able to eat whatever you want. But plug it into your personality. Are you someone that likes to eat whatever the fuck you want? Great. Go train, go move, go work out a lot. And the more calories you burn, the more you can screw off over here. If you're someone that doesn't really like to train, or sedentary because you sit behind a chair all day, you eat you walk 3,000 steps a day, you go to the gym twice a week, you take 5 days off. Well, guess what? Your diet and your lifestyle is going to have to change pretty dramatically to be able to accommodate that, right? And the diet side of it, just to be specific with the calories in, is going to be a lot less than someone that's obviously more active. So I always just like to remind people that there always is 2 sides that we can play with. And generally the best is kind of a little bit of both. The last one I wrote, like a little bonus thing, is like behavior self-monitoring. So one of these things that I think makes a lot of this work is the environmental design and logging of food or tracking to some degree. Like, I like some type of system around figuring out the data, like, just basically, how do I track some level of data? Can I track this based off scale and body composition? I can track this off calories and protein only. I can track this off all macros only. You know, like, there's ways to log food. I could take pictures of food and send it to my coach and my nutritionist. There's so many different ways that we can look at. I can look at blood work. But then the big thing is the environmental design. It's like, if I'm a parent that has a bunch of shitty food for my kids around the house, yeah, natural byproducts is you're going to be eating more shitty food. That's kind of like a little bonus tip, is like, there are things that make these strategies more effective long-term for people. So, all right, well, that one is a little longer than I thought it was going to be, but hopefully some good stuff for everybody. So, as always, if you feel like this was a valuable episode, please share it with somebody that needs to hear it, your partner, your roommate. This is obviously one of those little hacks that I will say kind of benefits all of us. And then, as always, I'll see everyone next week. Take care.